Well, welcome back to our continued study in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 10, and this is a very powerful chapter. There are a great number of things we can learn as we listen, particularly to the scriptures, not necessarily what I say, but what we see in the scriptures themselves. Cornelius had just gone through a shocking experience. An angel had told him to contact this Peter, who was staying with another Simon called a tanner, and this was being referred to a complete stranger. And yet this Cornelius, a person that the Jews would consider a heathen or a pagan, and yet he was a man who did good works, and God saw those works. So we pick it up in verse 9. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to the earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." In other words, he was that's a shock to his system, because the Judean laws were very strict about what could be eaten and what could not be eaten, and what would make you unclean if you did such things. But in verse 15, the voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. That must have been quite an experience. And I suppose Peter was still hungry at this point. But remember, Peter was a Jew, very devoutly so. He was not very interested at this time in showing the Gentiles the salvation God offers through the death and resurrection of Christ, although he had witnessed some who had come to believe in Jesus. He was a Jew. What had he to do with these Gentiles, which the Jews referred to as dogs, the Gentiles? He still had not fully adjusted to the idea that non-Israelites could actually be saved. Oh, he knew it here probably, but down here where his culture for years and years and years had trained him to be very separate from the Gentiles. So we pick it up in verse 17. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, and probably hungry still, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out asking Simon, who was known as Peter, if he was staying there. And the scriptures continue completely from verse 18 on. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you." Now remember, this was not too long after Pentecost. It may have been months, or it could have been a year or so. Can't be certain. But he had heard these commands, and he was wondering about this. What's really going on here? These men sent by Cornelius, they appeared at. They're going to go. They're going to surprise Peter, actually. So in verse 20, the angel goes on. "So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" Well, I guess I'd have to ask the same question myself if somebody came to my front door and said, "We've been sent here by a very high-ranking official. Would you come with us? He wants to see you." The men replied, We have come from Cornelius, the centurion. That's a heathen Roman officer in the army, yet a man who had a righteous life and was doing very good for people. He helped the poor and the needy. This was a little hard for Peter to digest so soon after the death and resurrection of the Messiah of the Jews, although the Jewish leaders didn't recognize that, but they had thousands of followers by now in Jerusalem. And we pick it up again, verse 22, we have come from Cornelius, the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. Now some might presume that was presumptive of Peter, who was a guest in Simon the tanner's house, to invite more. These officials and this particularly devout soldier who was a servant of Cornelius. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. It sounds almost strange, doesn't it? Well, Peter at this point was a guest himself, like I said, now imposing his guests on the hospitality of Simon the tanner. Cornelius sent what the Bible calls a devout soldier who was one of his servants. During their conversation, the devout soldier told him in full detail what Cornelius had heard and seen in the vision. And Cornelius, of course, had related it to this devout soldier, and in those days they would have memorized it word by word and repeated it to Peter. I doubt Peter asked the messenger, what God does your centurion boss worship? I doubt he asked that. I'm certain Peter was still mulling over the vision in his own mind, wondering what this all meant. The top around the table of Simon the tanner's house must have been extremely interesting at that point. At some time, probably a little bit disturbing to Peter. He was going through a pretty life-changing experience here, and in fact, a ministry-changing experience. And sometimes, let's face it, it's hard to adjust our thinking sometime to what God's instructions are to us. Even as we read the Word of God itself, we sometimes feel, should I, can I, must I? And yes, we must. When God speaks, we should obey. But Peter began to start, for the first times perhaps, really thinking outside the box, which had controlled his life since childhood. One cannot help but wonder whether Peter even got much sleep that night. I suspect he prayed more, which was his habit. One cannot help but believe that he was really waiting on God for help and strength to obey. And next study, we're going to see what Christian community really means when it comes to the mixture of different races, different religions, and people with totally different cultures. Stay with us as we continue to study. Meanwhile, God bless you until our next study. Be well.